The Enneagram. It's like the 16 types except with 7 less types, so much easier. To keep it simple, I'm focusing on the core type without the wings included. Adding those would be more nuanced and varied, and instinctual variants would take that a step further, so keep that in mind. There is a debate about whether certain combinations of personality type and Enneagram type are actually possible. The reason being that if you put certain combinations together, their descriptions can be conflicting, or even contradictory at times. In this video, I'm not going to say that certain combinations are impossible, but rather unlikely. Human personality is complex and amorphous. It is possible for a person to be paradoxical in ways. Someone might be highly productive and very lazy at the same time. It just depends on what activity they're doing. Someone might be an ultra-energetic, larger-than-life performer on stage, but then very quiet and socially withdrawn. I do believe that a person can be two opposing things at once. I will add the eternal caveat that the more granular you go, the more tricky and even dangerous it becomes with personality types. They work very well as archetypical and broad descriptions, but it's easy to get lost in the details. So as always, be careful. Anyone who's on the Love Who Discord server will know Susie. She has been my Enneagram co-conspirator in making this video, which has been brewing as an idea for a long time. Please check out her excellent Enneagram channel. The link for that is down below. Type 1s. Honest, fair, ethical, and responsible. They are perfectionistic. They are rigorous and righteous people who want to avoid mistakes at all cost. Moral integrity is their motto, and they gain their self-worth by being good. With people they can be judicious and critical, and struggle with being judgmental and quite rigid. Their deepest fear is corruption, imperfection, and falling below their standards. ISTP. Type 1s like to know what the rules and standards are. That's a way they can measure themselves and see how well they're doing. ISTPs are a much more independent breed. External rules don't do much for them. If the rules disagree with their logic, they won't be followed. ISTPs aren't usually the most orderly people either. They prize adaptability and freedom, so don't like to be tied down. They'll be more comfortable in chaos than a Type 1, and won't value structure in the same way. So ISTPs, unlikely. ESTP. Restrictions and preordained ways of doing things are anathema to the ESTP. ESTPs want as much immediate activity as possible, seeing the methodical route as too slow. Type 1s are people who, out of a desire to be a good person, fight back against some of their impulses. ESTPs, by contrast, are impulsive. In fact, they believe in living their life on impulse. Type 1s are responsible. ESTPs can be reckless. So, unlikely. ISFP. The ISFP archetype is, in part, characterized by a rebellious spirit. Their function is often to show the wisdom of taking an individual path or stand. The more systematic approach is not for them. Type 1s, as a byproduct of their nature, don't have an issue with being conventional, or at least a conventional version of what's respected. ISFPs embrace unconventionality, both in themselves and other people. In order for an ISFP to be a Type 1, they would need to be operating from a place of weakness, which is never sustainable. So ISFPs, unlikely. ESFP. ESFPs barely notice the existence of rules, let alone follow them. As an archetype, ESFPs are more likely to be the person chastised by the Type 1 for being wild, chaotic, and disruptive. Being rigid, austere, and inflexible are not ESFP problems. This is an easy unlikely. ENTJ. There are some versions of ENTJs that the Type 1 fits with, and others that it doesn't. If you have an ENTJ who's TE heavy, someone who's all in on systems, procedures, the workings of an organization, the carefully crafted rules to enable efficiency and effectiveness, then I could see it. That ENTJ would be stubbornly rigid in defense of those best practices. However, other types of ENTJ are more risk-taking, fluid, and willing to move fast and break things. I can see many ENTJs caring more about success than about the fear of corruption. However, some ENTJs can be perfectionistic and unwavering in the maintenance of their personal standards. I imagine an ENTJ in the education system wanting to be a model student, for example. On balance, I'll put them in possible. INTJ. If we compare them to their ENTJ brethren, Type 1 fits much more for the INTJ. INTJs can be people who strive for perfection, sometimes to a maniacal extent. They can also push other people in the same way, with some brutality and ruthlessness. Or in another sense, they hold people to the standards they believe they can reach, which is a tough but genuine kind of love. INTJs also heavily lean on their FI. It's a compass for them in life. They are principled people. Deviating from that would be a sort of corruption for them, and that is a fear. These types of INTJs are purists. Imagine a Stoic who holds themselves to a certain standard of excellence. The only counter I have to this is the amount of times that I've heard INTJs say that rules, regulations, and systems are really dumb. But that simply means the INTJ would replace them with their own rules and systems, which are better. So I'll put INTJ in likely. INFP. INFPs are known as wanderers. Type 1s are scheduled and structured. The rhythm of these two types' lives are entirely opposed. INFPs are usually tranquil and gentle. Type 1s have a stiff intensity to them, and can be quite cutting and harsh when insisting on certain standards. Type 1s place great esteem on competency. It's what they fall back on in life, especially in times of stress and conflict. That is not really what INFPs pull out of their toolkit in such times. So INFPs, unlikely. ENFP. Type 1s ascribe to the notion that there is a right way or best way to do something. They put a lot of time into establishing what the best approach is, but once found, they'll perfect it. ENFPs are any DOMs. They reinvent the wheel because, it's been a day already. Wheels are boring now. Type 1s value order and structure. ENFPs naturally tend away from that. They often have to reimpose structure in their life because it is regularly lost. A chaotic Type 1 is an oxymoron. One slight caveat is that a mature and well-developed ENFP can resemble an ESTJ, or at least be able to dip into that mode. So they do have their moments where this archetype fits, but on the whole, unlikely. ENFJ. ENFJs are way more likely to have Type 1 as their wing, since they're often 2s. ENFJs are both emotionally astute and intuitive. Type 1s prize objectivity and rationality. ENFJs are capable of that, of course, but it's not their desired default state. There is some overlap when it comes to wanting to fit in with social norms, but FE isn't necessarily that. It's more about adjusting to the situation or the person you're dealing with. Type 1s are able to make a whole group change in order to be a certain way. ENFJs are more the adapters, so ENFJ, unlikely. INFJ. The emotional vice of the Type 1 is anger. It's a fundamental emotional struggle that they must work through. INFJs don't really have anger as a common emotional response to stress. One function strongly correlated with the Type 1 is TE, and INFJs have that as a blind spot. Despite being planful and future-focused, INFJs are strangely non-methodical and even disorganized. Although yes, they will have high standards for themselves, they won't ever enforce that on people, or even make too much of a case for it unless compelled to. So INFJs, unlikely. ENTP. Many of the same reasons as the ESTP and ENFP apply here. ENTPs are great at knowing what is expected of them, be that socially, at school, in a job, and so on. The problem is that doesn't mean they're going to be what you expect. In fact, they might use that insight they have to completely go against it. ENTPs are natural troublemakers who will intentionally subvert, anything, just for the sake of it. So ENTPs, unlikely. INTP. INTPs are generally chilled out people. They definitely don't have that self-imposed rigour and unsparing discipline of the Type 1. Their priorities in life are also totally different. INTPs are about understanding the world. Type 1s, they are more doers, whereas INTPs are thinkers. So INTP, also unlikely. ISFJ. ISFJs tend to take commitments seriously, and are busy bees generally when tending to their responsibilities and people. They are both dedicated to improving things and doing the right thing. ISFJs, while hard workers, are also more mellow and comfort creatures, and adapt a lot more to people than to an inner critic that tells them they're being good or bad. Type 1s, if they're not careful, can get a reputation of being arrogant or bossy when telling people what they should be doing. That is never really something that ISFJs run afoul of. Type 1 is not the best fit for ISFJs, but it's certainly possible. ESFJ. Type 1s are driven by a specific kind of internal compass for what's right and wrong. For ESFJs, they measure the right thing in a more utilitarian sense, i.e., the greatest good for the most amount of people. That's very much an FETI way to think about it, as opposed to the more TIFE way that Type 1s tend to see it. There isn't a one-to-one connection with those functions, but that's one way to think about it. ESFJs are most energized by people and really shine in that light and sparkling social energy. Type 1s, by contrast, can be a bit more reluctant to really let loose and let their hair down. I think this pairing is unlikely. ESTJ. If I were to list out the following words: structured, methodical, principled, ethical, disciplined, perfectionistic, exacting, and forceful, they all apply to both Type 1s and ESTJs. ESTJs are take-charge people who can get or force people to function like well-oiled machines. They can set, maintain, and sometimes enforce high standards, often through nothing more than the intensity of their personalities. In true reformer fashion, they can also criticize and improve places, as opposed to only being people who uphold the status quo. So ESTJs, unlikely. ISTJ. ISTJs are known as being dutiful, loyal, and hardworking. They are also meticulous. They hate mistakes and, if possible, want their plans and systems to run smoothly and without disorder. They both share a dislike of deviating from what is right, and are masters of self-control when needed. Both are sticklers for details, and almost nothing escapes their high-standard scanning eye. This relentless nature can be tough for the people around them, especially if they're not wired in the same way. So ISTJs, likely. Type 2s. Giving, supportive and sensitive. They are warm, relational people. Uplifting with love and care is their motto. They desire approval and love through the act of giving. With people they are collaborative, encouraging and compassionate. They struggle with people-pleasing, being needy and resentful. Their deepest fear is being unloved and unwanted. Okay, ESTPs. I see ESTPs as very explorative, wanting to absorb the variety of the world, fearlessly and naturally. That is not how Type 2s approach life. ESTPs are roguish and more independent, free-spirited charmers, which is not the same brand of charm that Type 2s usually display. Type 2s are exceptionally relational, and the bottom line is that ESTPs are more independent, and 2s more dependent. In fact, Type 2s struggle for personal freedom because of the somewhat trapping nature of being so relationship-focused. 2s like to have a specific role in people's lives, whereas ESTPs don't like to be defined, or in their minds, restricted in that way. So I'll put ESTPs in unlikely. ISTP. ISTPs are driven by mastery and skill acquisition, which can often be a solo or isolated way to be. This is a different focus than 2s, who are the most interpersonal type. ISTPs have FE inferior and can often disappear, and that's totally natural for them. In fact, it's beneficial in some ways. 2s can disappear as well, but this tends to be when they're unhealthy. It would be used more in a manipulative way to get love back, for example, or because they feel hurt in some way. ISTPs disappear because they have stuff to do, or have just had enough of humans. They don't need that much FE validation, so ISTPs, also in unlikely. INFJ. They have FE as their second function, and are often rightly described as wanting to guide people. That's 2ish, but they're also NI-DOMs, so ultimately they are still internally driven and internally focused to a degree, while the focus of the 2 is external first. INFJs are often private people. However, I think they share the Type 2's harmonic pattern, which is how types deal with conflict and disappointment. That pattern is positive outlook. So if there's an interpersonal issue, they'll say, "Oh no, that's fine, don't worry," putting that positive slant on things, always. Or they'll feel like people can be reconciled together after conflict, so that aspect matches. So INFJs have FE as a strong function, but it's sometimes obscured by their NI. They might be prone to focusing on thinking about human nature at large, as opposed to specific people in their life. So I can see the case for likely, but possible is a better fit in my view, because of them valuing NI and TI greatly, which aren't as 2ish in nature. So I'll put INFJs in possible. ENFJ. ENFJs are usually 2s. They are FE DOMs, and because the Type's 2 focus of attention is external, they are hyper aware of the feelings and needs of others and how to meet those needs, especially emotional ones, and adjust themselves to be what the other person wants. So FE DOMs are likely 2s. The Type 2's social style of interacting is compliant, i.e., complying with the needs of others by so-called self-abnegation, so they deny their own needs in favour of other people. It's a common ENFJ tendency, and something they struggle with a lot. Rectifying that recurring imbalance is a massive challenge for them, an archetypical challenge. So I'll put ENFJs in likely. ENTP. This will be very similar reasoning to the ESTP. ENTPs want to remain untethered as much as possible. Although they value relationships and interactions with people, it's for the insight, perspectives, and just fun much of the time. It's not typically out of a desire to entwine themselves deeply in an interpersonal way, with the exception of a small handful of people. So ENTPs are unlikely. INTP. INTPs are very internally focused, often analysing or lost in their thoughts. FE is their inferior function, so it's oppressed or oppressed by the TI. So again, they are not relationally focused. An INTP will tell you when you're wrong. They'll prize rationality and objectivity over placating people. The harmonic pattern of the Type 2 is positive outlook. They are very humanistic. INTPs, by comparison, can be much more in the vein of cynics, or exponents of harsh truths. They don't feel a need to put a positive spin on things. If something is bad, and that's the truth of it, that is what you're going to get. So INTPs are unlikely. ISFJ. The dominant SI of ISFJs is fueled by their FE. This in combination makes them concrete helpers. ISFJs are quite private people, but when it comes to the dedication they show to their inner circle, they are ultra relationship focused. Compared with ISFJs are more grounded. Their relationships with people have much more of a direct and practical feel to them. INFJs are more in their heads, even to the point of detachment at times. That's far less common with ISFJs. This means their FE is able to focus more on specific individuals in a more straightforward way. An INFJ might be able to conceptualize what path you should be on as a person, whereas an ISFJ is more likely to literally help you get down that path. The Type 2 archetype suits the ISFJ extremely well. I'm going to put them in likely. ESFJs will have the same reasoning as ENFJs and ISFJs combined. They're very relationship-focused and people-oriented. They have a strong desire to help people in a very concrete way, and they simply dedicate much of their lives to this. 2s are kind, generous, warm-hearted, and loving at their best. In times of disintegration or unhealthiness, they can be manipulative, people-pleasing, enmeshed, or codependent. Both the positive and negative traits map onto ESFJs extremely consistently, so ESFJs are unlikely. ENTJ. The way that an ENTJ takes care of you is very different from the way that a Type 2 does. Let's just put it that way. ENTJs are actually very much focused on helping people. There's actually very little way around it. If you're an efficiency-seeking, problem-solving machine, that's going to end up benefiting anyone who comes into contact with the system you're creating or improving. Tough love is what ENTJs often bring to bear. But tough love isn't the way of the Type 2. They prefer, lovey love. So ENTJ, unlikely. INTJ. Very similar reasoning as with the ENTJ, except adding FE blindness into the mix. I do actually think INTJs are often warmer than ENTJs, and warmer than the descriptions portray them. But again, their way of showing love and support is not going to be in the style of a Type 2. For example, an INTJ might genuinely see criticizing you as an act that comes from a place of love, even if it might hurt your feelings in the short term. That more brutal mindset is rarely consistent with the way the Type 2 would go about things. So INTJ, unlikely. ISFP. ISFPs are empathetic. They're caring, but at the same time are independent and introspective, moved more so by what they value, even if it's against the grain. Being an FI dom is more likely to result in clashes with people, especially early in life. I see this combo as somewhat neutral as it relates to the Type 2. I wouldn't rule it out since, as I said, ISFPs can be deeply empathetic, but I don't think Type 2 is likely for them. ISFPs are among the most independent types, often making them loners, so this can go both ways. I'll put them in possible. ESFP. ESFPs are highly social, outgoing, and externally focused. They also share a positive outlook with 2s, but I don't see putting other people's needs above their own as a big issue for them. They will happily do the opposite though, often in a highly independent way. In fact, ESFPs are more likely to be selfish than overly self-sacrificing. They love people, but don't want to be tied to them, unless it's in the fun way. So ESFPs, in unlikely. ENFP. Out of all the EP types, I think ENFPs are most likely to be Type 2s, but I'm not sure if that actually makes them likely in general. ENFPs are often welcoming, friendly, and engaging towards others, commonly with a desire to bring value to people, sometimes even to society as a whole. So there's a people-centric side to ENFPs, much more commonly I would say than for ESFPs, ESTPs, and ENTPs. I don't particularly see an argument for or against. I think I'll put ENFPs in possible. They somehow have a 2-ish flavour that the other EP types kind of lack. INFP. INFPs are another tricky type to place on here. They are independent, even to the point of being loners or detached from others. They might even find this quite desirable at various points in their life. So they don't necessarily have that 2-esque intense focus on relationships. However, they do often have an extremely supportive nature. They won't, like ENTJs and INTJs for example, take the tough love approach. Instead, they prefer a more gentle touch. They are also a curious combination of flighty and stable. Perhaps this simply depends on the INFP in question. If they really value and lean into that SI of theirs, I can see them wanting stable and consistent relationships, instead of periodically disappearing into the ether. I think I'll put INFPs in possible. ISTJ. ISTJs are FE blind, so they don't mind ruffling emotional feathers when asserting what people ought to be doing in life. When they care about you, they'll make sure you're on the right track by any means necessary, and not always by falling into that gentle supporter archetype. Again, it's a case of the style of how something is done, preventing them from being a particular Enneagram type. Their main function of SI is kind of perfect grounding for steadily taking care of someone. It's a very safe and secure function. However, it is backed by TE, hence them taking a full, no-nonsense approach to, well, everything. Simply, it's caring done differently. So I'll put ISTJ in unlikely. ESTJ. This one is also tricky to justify using the functions alone. It's more of a vibe thing. 2 similar types, ENTJs and ISTJs, are both in unlikely. But to me, ESTJs feel like they should be possible. Yes, they can be blunt and brutal, like those 2 other types, but they're much more relational and social than ISTJs, and much more focused on directly helping and assisting people. They can be very duty and family-oriented, and in that sense, very action-based protective 2s. So I'll put them tentatively in possible. Type 3s. ambitious, driven, and image conscious. With people they are inspiring, competitive, and persuasive. By any means necessary is their motto. They are performative pragmatists, and their struggles include being inauthentic and pushing themselves too much. Their deepest fear is being worthless or a failure. ESTP. The Type 3's focus of attention is external, and their social style is assertive and high energy. This matches up pretty well with ESTPs. ESTPs like to be doing things. They are active people. They also like to go after what they want in a direct way, which is typical of the Type 3s. Type 3s can be very charming, but it's often done with an aim in mind, which is how ESTPs tend to use their FE. So I can totally see ESTPs being in that go-getter mold, someone who values measurable achievement, is highly competitive, and may, shocking as it sounds, be inclined to self-promote and, well, emphasize their achievements. I'm going to put ESTP in likely. ISTP. Despite being quite similar types, ISTPs I think will differ a lot on this one. Having FE as their inferior function means it's unlikely for ISTPs to focus on or care about their image much, which is the main struggle or core of 3s. If anything, ISTPs are more likely to not care at all what other people think, so this is an easy one. ISTPs, unlikely. INFJ. 3s are chameleons. They change their personality depending on their goal and the people they are with. I can see how an INFJ would do the same, since they understand people well and adapt to them, yet don't share their inner self readily. One thing that characterizes Type 3s, if they're not careful, is a lack of introspection. That means they're out of touch with their own feelings and emotions. I have described INFJs in the past as sometimes struggling with the same thing. Because they're so outwardly focused on other people, they neglect themselves in that area. However, because they have NI as their dominant function and strong TI, both of which are introspective, analytical, and reflective, I don't think it's going to be a deep issue for them. I could make the case for INFJs being impossible, but I lean more towards unlikely. There is overlap, but it doesn't run deep. ENFJs. They both share an external focus of attention, that constant evaluation of self-image. The fixation of the 3 is vanity, acquiring praise or admiration for the self, anything that serves as a boost to the ego. I can see ENFJs being like that, especially in their quest for helping people, motivating them, and not wanting to rock the boat. 3s, however, are much more assertive than the typical ENFJ. If you have a particularly assertive and ambitious ENFJ, then it could definitely fit. However, if you have an ENFJ who is more supportive or not desiring to be disagreeable, it wouldn't fit. So they are in between on this one, in my mind. I'm going to put them in possible. ENTP. It's useful to compare ENTPs with ESTPs here. I don't see any obvious reason why ENTPs can't be a Type 3. Type 3s value competency, which totally fits for ENTPs. ENTPs can love achievement. They can be competitive. They can also be people who are capable of that conman-esque style of creating an overly favourable impression of themselves to, well, anyone. They can definitely be out of touch with their own feelings as well. The reason possible feels like a better fit is because ENTPs can be quite variable. You could find an ENTP who is just in their cave all day, exploring fun ideas without caring what other people think about whatever they're working on. There might be ENTPs who very much revel in the fact that they're controversial or divisive, which a Type 3 would be far more reluctant to do, even with their disagreeable nature. So I'll put ENTPs in possible. ISFP. ISFPs should know pretty early and strongly what they do like and dislike in life. Trying to reconcile those things with the practicalities of life is another story, but they do know what they like. 3s, by contrast, often struggle with this. They pursue things because they feel those things will, for want of a better phrase, make them look good or be seen favourably. They want to be impressive. ISFPs really don't approach life in this way very often at all. They value authenticity first and foremost, and won't make major life choices based on how things will look to others. So ISFPs are unlikely. ESFP. They have FI as their second and highly valued function. So that clashes with the 3 somewhat. But both are assertive, high energy, confident, and often image-centric in a way, since ESFPs are often performers in some form. To be that, you have to be highly cognizant of how you come across. ESFPs can be fiery and explosive even, and Type 3s will be reluctant to ever do that, precisely because of those damaging effects on their reputation and image. But at the same time, ESFPs can be charming. If they are locked into a goal, they will be able to maintain that composure. I'll put ESFPs in possible. ENFP. Both ENFPs and Type 3s are externally focused, but I feel that ENFPs are too scattered and random to be Type 3s often. 3s are controllers, and that definitely clashes with the free-spiritedness of an ENFP. When you combine the changeable nature of ENFPs with the desire to be authentic, I don't think that matches up well with a Type 3. Type 3s have a certain kind of consistency, and consistency is not a very ENFP thing. I'll put ENFPs in unlikely. INFP. INFPs are probably the least 3 of all the types. They are FI DOMs and SE blind. They also have TE inferior. So, they'll want to be on their own path in life, regardless of whether that looks good, or impressive, or desirable. They simply do not care about that stuff. Type 3s can be extreme dynamo machines, the first to pursue something with a drive to win, but, all the while, not really being aware if they actually like that thing in the first place. So Type 3s definitely do not swim in INFP waters. So INFPs are an easy, unlikely. ISTJ. Both types do share assertiveness and enjoy competition. They value competency and efficiency, but ISTJs have FE as a blind spot. They aren't chameleons. When someone claims to be the best or amazing at something in front of a crowd, unless it is true, ISTJs will find that kind of obnoxious. I see it best summarized in the following quote. Any man who must say, "I am the king," is no true king. The self-promoting instincts of the Type 3 don't really apply at all to the ISTJ. So ISTJs, unlikely. ESTJ. Assertive, driven, goal-oriented, and externally focused. ESTJs seem to fit surprisingly well as 3s. Both types have a natural tendency to measure success in life with external metrics. It can take them a long time and a lot of growth to value those more intangible and individual ways of assessing a successful life. I would go as far as to say that ESTJs are the best type at achieving what they set out to achieve. They are a great match for the Type 3, so I'll put them in likely. INTP. There are similarities with the Type 3 in the shared desire for competency. However, for the Type 3, competency is usually regarding getting things done. It's productivity and achievement. I think that INTPs prefer to be behind-the-scenes kind of people whenever possible. So, on the grounds of them not being productivity or image-focused, INTPs are in unlikely. ISFJ. They are both efficient types and can deal with people extremely well. But the reasoning behind the actions of the ISFJ and the Type 3 differ a lot. ISFJs feel responsible and value hard work, but from more of a supportive role, whereas Type 3s enjoy being centre stage. Again, ISFJs are generally out of the spotlight kind of people. That is entirely due to preference, not lack of ability. So I'll put ISFJs in unlikely. ESFJ. FE DOMs can be chameleons who adjust themselves in pretty much all situations. That's instinctive for them. ESFJs in particular always want to give good experiences. I'd say they're very reputation-oriented and take their social standing seriously, all of which are very 3-esque in nature. Much like the ENFJs, I can see a strong side to the ESFJs that is very 3-like. I'll put ESFJs in possible. ENTJ. ENTJs are the perfect match with the Type 3's focus of attention, which is external, their response to stress, which is upping the competency and productivity pathologically, and their social style, which is assertive. Both ENTJs and Type 3s are high energy and goal-oriented. The Type 3 issue of being out of touch with what they truly like, and instead favouring what works, exactly mirrors the TE-FI imbalance that ENTJs experience. This combination is extremely common. In some ways, the ENTJ is the archetypical Type 3, so I'll put them in likely. INTJ. Ambition is certainly something that I associate with them. They can also be competitive and driven to achieve. The image-focused aspect of 3s really is a big part of what makes them the type they are. So the fact that INTJs don't match that, and at times revel in going against social norms and stirring people up, makes me think that unlikely is the best option. Type 4s. Highly variable, intensely emotional, and sensitive. They are introspective people who seek to know themselves, hoping they'll find someone unique when they do. With people they are empathetic and expressive. They are prone to spells of melancholy, and struggle with envy, being withdrawn, and self-absorption. Their deepest fear is being insignificant or ordinary. ESTP. Possibly the least 4 type of all. 4s are withdrawn, their focus of attention is internal, and their fixation or sin in the Enneagram system is melancholy, and feeling like someone who is outcast. These aren't typically things you'd expect ESTPs to feel. They are more outwardly focused and aggressive towards the world. So ESTPs, an easy unlikely. ISTP. Even if they can be withdrawn, like the 4s, I think ISTPs are way too logical and rationally based to share that core issue of the 4s, which is a sense of alienation, or that something is wrong with me, and no one feels the way that I do. 4s can often be viewed as hypersensitive, not necessarily in the negative sense, but in terms of being ultra-receptive and sensitive to things. They are susceptible to both feeling the good and bad of life, with equal intensity. This isn't really the ISTP approach to things, so ISTPs, also unlikely. INFJ. When you are withdrawn, like the 4s, and insular, you live to a large degree inside your own mind. It can be a fantasy world, somewhere rich and secretive, something entirely your own. With an NI-DOM and NIFE, I think it's similar. A 4 can imagine interacting with people in their fantasy realm and really develop that world to a scary degree. Hence, I think, the notion of them being creative, or artists and writers. They are internal world builders. The 4's attention goes to the best of the past or future and to what is missing or not enough in the present. NI and INFJs often exist anywhere but the present moment. That can be looking forward in the stereotypical NI planning way, or thinking about the past as well. Either way, both of these mental states connect to this notion of being withdrawn and inwardly focused, which lines up very well with the type 4. Another aspect is a preoccupation with questions of identity, which, although it's not mentioned often, I think INFJs very much have. So I'll put INFJs in likely. ENFJ. ENFJs are very externally focused. They also don't have the reactive nature of the type 4. 4s might give highly emotionally charged responses. This happens when they're triggered into it in some way. An FE-DOM typically would be too conscious of how they're affecting others to be that way. Given how pro-social ENFJs are, I don't think that lines up with the sense of alienation and being outcast that 4s often have. So ENFJs, unlikely. ENTP. A lot of this is the same reasoning as ESTPs. 4s often struggle with finding their place in the world. Again, it's about identity. Who am I? Who am I really? ENTPs, being FI blind, tend not to spend too much time worrying about that stuff. They are focused on different external things. More than that, ENTPs might not even like the notion of a settled identity, preferring instead to maintain that fluidity always. So ENTPs, unlikely. INTP. I think that INTPs have a greater chance of being type 4s than ENTPs do. Again, the type 4's focus of attention is internal and their social style is withdrawn. Those parts fit for INTPs who, unlike the ISTP, don't have that SE which will keep them out of their head and in flesh world. 4s are often described as very imaginative, and I believe that TI, fueled by NE, is precisely that. I think that INTPs can often feel ostracized. Compared with the people around them, they might see the world very differently. I've come to see the TI need for honesty, truth, and speaking your mind as a form of authenticity. So, I'll put INTPs in possible. ISFJ. I see SI as absorbing impressions vividly, then attaching meaning to them. I've seen the function described as having an impressionistic quality, which I agree with. 4s value depth and hate superficiality, and are sensitive to the art and beauty of the world. 4s need to connect personally to everything, so those qualities do line up. ISFJs can definitely have their silent spells when upset, and can certainly pull away into their introverted realm. However, ISFJs are on firm ground, and 4s are the opposite of firm ground. SI is an underappreciated function, one that's not well understood or well described. Often we associate capturing an essence or vibe with FI, especially artistically, but it's very much an SI thing too, I believe. In that sense, SI is impressionistic, which is typically something we associate with abstractness. I think there is enough overlap to put ISFJs in possible. ESFJ. ESFJs are welcoming and on the cheerful side of life. They make you feel like a friend right away. They're social, focused on others, and pretty practical and hands-on. If an ESFJ is in their head for a long time, that's probably a bad sign, and because something is on their mind much more than usual. I think their outward focus on its own is enough to make ESFJs unlikely. ENTJ. Very similar rationale to the ESTP. 4s have the harmonic pattern of being reactive, which for them means an emotionally charged response to fear of rejection, seeing it as a reflection of them as a person and who they are. 4s can often be, for want of a better word, indecisive, often because they're exploring how they actually feel about things. ENTJs tend to know exactly what they're going for and go for it. I think they're one of the least likely types to be 4s, so I'll put them in unlikely. INTJ. This might be one of those combinations that people class as highly unlikely or even impossible, but my gut reaction is that there is some overlap, maybe even a lot. This comes down to INTJs being more emotional and emotionally driven than we think. That comes from the presence and prominence of their FI. Although they might evaluate things and make choices through a seemingly cold lens, when you dig a bit deeper, you will find a personal attachment to their work. It's a reflection of them as individuals. They care about it. It matters. Another adjacent data point is how many ISFPs and INTJs mistype in both directions. INTJs are also a very philosophical type, so questions of identity and meaning and purpose and individuality are very prominent for them. So both INTJs and 4s can be in their heads and withdrawn, care deeply, in my view, about identity and who they are, have a strong emotional investment in, well, all their choices, their work, and their creativity, can definitely feel alienated precisely for being who they are extremely authentic. In the case of INTJs, they are FE blind, so almost have to be authentic. So in my view, despite some big divergences, there is enough there to put INTJs in possible. ISFP. ISFPs match up really well with the type 4. Carving out that individual identity is important to them. It's essential for them to be living their own lives. At times, they'd rather get less objective success by living on their own terms than by playing, in their mind, other people's games. Also, they line up well with the emotional volatility of the type 4. 4s are least in line with the functions of TE and FE. ISFPs have TE inferior and value FI most of all. I view ISFPs as a fundamentally romantic type. That brings with it a paradoxical sense of optimism and hope, yet deep cynicism and melancholy. ISFPs deeply embody the type 4's vibe, and all of the pain and beauty that comes with that. ESFP. I keep mentioning this notion of 4s being withdrawn. This is their so-called social style in the Enneagram system. They don't have that outward-facing, aggressive and forceful approach. ESFPs do have that approach, which is a big clash with the type 4s. But there are certain similarities, such as ESFPs being emotionally reactive, especially to things regarding their identity, being authentic, and fighting for who they are. So it's a slightly mixed bag in terms of the overlap between them. I'm going to put them in possible, but it would have to be a fairly socially introverted ESFP to match up with the type 4. I have seen enough examples of this to believe it's possible. ENFP. A slightly weird one here, which I often say about ENFPs. ENFPs are NE-DOMs, which implies a sense of high energy and outward focus. But, as you'll often hear, they can often be very socially introverted. So when it comes to the type 4, I could give similar reasoning for both the ENFPs and INFPs, since they'll come across similarly in many ways. They both value authenticity, i.e. expressing who they are, and investing as much time as they need to find out exactly who that is. They can also be emotionally reactive when it comes to dealing with stress, conflict, and disappointment, which is characteristic of the type 4. I think ENFPs belong in likely INFP. Probably the most 4-ish of all the types. Melancholy, the fixation of the 4, seems to fit with them. There is the stereotype of them being tortured artists, creating works of deep emotional pain. INFPs are happy to follow their emotions wherever they lead them, even if that results in a certain amount of tumultuousness and volatility in how they approach life. So respect for their identity, emotions, and reaping the rewards and suffering the consequences of that approach fits both INFPs and the type 4 really well. So INFPs in likely. ISTJ. It's interesting to compare ISTJs with INTJs, the latter of which I put impossible. I think the difference here is the intuitive function. INTJs are NI-DOMs, so they can very easily occupy that inner world for long periods of time. In contrast, ISTJs are almost totally grounded in external reality in some form. They deeply value their FI function, so they're very much pro-authenticity, but ISTJs are rarely going to feel like outcasts, outsiders, and misunderstood. They are happy to fit in with how things are if it makes logical sense to them. They're also not going to be emotionally reactive either. So ISTJs, unlikely. ESTJ. For ESTJs, preoccupations with identity are not common. In fact, they are so uncommon that it's a problem they have. They measure their life too much using objective metrics instead of the subjective and personal ones used by the type 4. You'll notice that there are groups of types that will have similar reasoning, so ESTJs match up well with the ENTJs and ISTJs. So it's unlikely for them. Type 5s. Analytical, curious, and attached. With people they are reserved yet observant. They are secretive, precise, minimalistic, and hate intrusions. They take great pleasure in and can't help themselves analysing the world in great detail. It secures them. They are also often out of touch with their emotions. Knowledge is power is their motto. Their deepest fear is being incompetent and being invaded. ESTP. Overall, 5s have a much lower observable energy, being withdrawn in their social style. The world to a 5 is unpredictable, chaotic, intrusive, and sometimes even threatening. Their focus of attention is internal. They disconnect from feelings and analyse them and the world internally before and after what happens. For better or worse, I've always seen ESTPs as high-energy people. They are outward-facing and expansive in their approach. They like to face the world head-on, without too much preconceived thought. So I think ESTPs are unlikely. ISTP. My gut reaction is that ISTPs are a good fit for type 5s. 5s have competency as their harmonic pattern. It's the thing they fall back on, the main tool with which they approach the world. They will turn to their competence in times of stress, and very much have a problem-solving mindset. As I've said before, ISTPs seek ultra-competence, skill, and mastery, so that fits well. 5s are withdrawn. Their mental realm is a safe and familiar place. Their fixation is stinginess. Stinginess is the desire to preserve. With the type 5, a lot of things are held back. That can also include the hoarding of knowledge. It's a precious resource to them. Although it may not seem like it at first, ISTPs are very much knowledge types. That can be obscured because they're so action-oriented. At least, that's what people see of them when they are out of their caves. The presence of SE definitely makes them less susceptible to some of the pitfalls of the Type 5, but they still fit very well in my view. Ultimately, their SE is in service of their TI. I think ISTPs belong in likely. INFJ. I've often described INFJs as the feeling person's thinker. So, if you have an INFJ who is more thinkery, then they'll fit well with the Type 5. INFJs have their TI quite balanced with their FE, but they still value it a great deal. It's very much a refuge for them, a source of relief, and something to fall back on. INFJs aren't fans of uncertainty or chaos. In fact, they fear those things to a degree. So I can see them compensating for that by gaining knowledge as much as possible, which very much lines up with the approach of the Type 5. So I'll put INFJs in possible. ENFJ. ENFJs value harmony, and 5s are not super thoughtful about social niceties. A Type 5 valuing harmony above competency and accuracy in certain situations is unlikely. In fact, 5s often have difficulties engaging with people, especially lots of people, which doesn't line up with ENFJs very much at all. Going back to the Type 5 fixation of stinginess, it makes them very reluctant to share their time and energy with people. Type 5s are very much energy conservers. ENFJs are the opposite. In fact, one of the big problems in life is being too frivolous and reckless with their energy. They give it away too much, and often burn out as a result. So ENFJs are unlikely. ENTP. I read a line about ENTPs that described them as constantly moving away from deprivation and toward variety and abundance. That is not 5-ish. 5s prefer to be minimalists, so to speak, whereas ENTPs are more maximalists. 5s don't like to spread themselves too thin, since they have this inherent fear that they don't have enough. Again, they want to hold and reserve things. There are some overlaps between these two though. Both Type 5s and ENTPs crave knowledge and seek it out. They also like to flex their minds, their insight, their competency. If you see a Type 5 or an ENTP debating, they will often have similar styles. Although ENTPs will use rhetoric and tactics and devices of that kind, they do like to wield their TI whenever possible. If you had a very socially introverted ENTP, I think that could fit enough with the Type 5, though it's not the most seamless. Like with all types, there is a spectrum, and I have seen ENTPs who very much fit the mold of homebodies, people who keep to themselves and aren't expansive in the typical ENTP way. They come across like INTPs, so I'm going to put ENTPs in possible. INTP. Understanding the world and gaining expertise is how 5s feel safe. They are observers who are not always engaging with the world. This matches the INTP to a T. Gaining knowledge and insight is a defense mechanism for Type 5s. I think it's a big risk for INTPs to attach their ego too much to being right. That is a big risk for the Type 5s as well. INTPs process the world through analysing it instead of experiencing it. It's an intellectual way to live in many respects. Their preoccupation is with understanding. Of all the types, the Type 5 would most agree with the notion that knowledge is power. I think that rings true for INTPs as well. I'll put them in likely. ISFJ. This is one where I might differ from the conventional wisdom. I think Type 5 is a plausible combination for ISFJs. Let's start with the arguments against. ISFJs typically won't have these social difficulties that Type 5s can have. Also, they won't be ungrounded like the Type 5. In fact, you could make the case that ISFJs are one of the most, if not the most, grounded type. However, they do match up in some ways. ISFJs can be very introverted, preferring to withdraw and be in their own private worlds most of the time. Also, much like the core fear of the Type 5, ISFJs fight back against uncertainty in life by acquiring knowledge. I'd describe them as a very knowledge-based type, in fact. Through understanding and competence, they can feel that stability, security, and safety they desire. Type 5s would typically be described as logical and analytical. ISFJs aren't known for this, but they should be. It might not be an extremely common combination, but I do think it's possible. So ISFJs, impossible. ESFJ. Lots of the same reasoning as the ENFJ for this one. I see ESFJs as immense energy expenders. In fact, that's a massive risk for them. So that stinginess the Type 5s are known for definitely does not apply to ESFJs. They're FE-DOMs and possess a social charm and relational brilliance which is, not exactly what Type 5s are known for. I think for this one, ESFJs are an easy unlikely. ENTJ. Even if ENTJs can be quite cerebral and academic in their more introverted variants, generally they have too much of a commanding and outgoing style to be Type 5s. Their dominant function of TE tends to project itself outward, trying to affect and impact the world. ENTJs are definitely not internal or withdrawn as a type. They have SE as their third function. It's something they like to satisfy, to indulge in, and feel mobilized by. They use it often, and with force, and valued SE isn't in line with the Type 5, unless they're in a period of stress. So ENTJ, unlikely. INTJ. introverted intuition is extremely internally focused. They qualify as having that deep internal world that I associate with the type 5. 5s strike me as the types to have a memory palace, and I imagine INTJs have an especially extravagant one. INTJs also line up well with the competency part of type 5s. They relish being expert at something, even to the point of being esoteric with it. Encountering an INTJ who values their own competence above all else is not going to be a surprising thing. In fact, it might be the norm for them. INTJs also match some of the most stereotypical 5 traits, such as compartmentalizing their emotions and reviewing them at a later date, struggling with intimacy at times, feeling somewhat disembodied or out of touch with the physical realm, and even things like being minimalists. INTJs are people who seem like they know better, because they often do, but they're driven to know for many of the same reasons as the type 5, so I'll put them in likely. ISFP. ISFPs are definitely prone to losing themselves in their own internal universe, but these types differ in a big way. Type 5s are going to be out of touch with their emotions, or will process them in a very matter-of-fact and detached way. ISFPs don't do that. Instead, they're going to happily live their emotions out and embrace that way of being. It's not that ISFPs are opposed to making decisions logically and processing the world that way. They can, and do. It's simply not their preference. So ISFPs, unlikely. ESFP. ESFPs don't match the type 5 very well. They are outwardly focused and happy to face uncertainty and threats by jumping into things and facing them with adaptability and force of will as much as with knowledge, often more so. ESFPs also often enjoy attention and the spotlight. They aren't going to shy away from that stuff like type 5s do, so the whole vibe doesn't fit very well. ESFPs are in unlikely. ENFP. 2 or 5, the world seems unpredictable and chaotic, even if they do enjoy investigating the unfamiliar. One of the 5's main compulsions is to avoid intrusion. They are very attached to a home base that is free from the potential of that. ENFPs can be introverted, deeply so. However, that sense of pulling away from the world is kind of anathema to the ENFP. They love travel, reaching out, connecting, exploring, expanding, building and crossing bridges to people. They want to lean in. All of those things fuel their NE, so despite their introversion, their focus is still outwards, towards the world, embracing the madness of it. So ENFPs are unlikely. INFP. I see INFPs as a hybrid between ISFPs and INTPs for the type 5. They have the clash that comes from being FI DOMs, but they're also in their head a lot. That function stack in a row of FI, NE, and SI is what I would describe as internally expansive. They branch out, but inwardly, in the abstract realm, the world of ideas. Since they have SE as a blind spot, they don't have that same forcefulness that ISFPs might have when it comes to venting their emotions. ISFPs can let that stuff out much more readily. With INFPs, it is more inward. In fact, I've often seen INFPs as strangely stoic. There is nothing about the INFP that makes them highly unlikely to pursue competence to compensate for their fears in life. It's not the most obvious overlap, but I'll put INFPs in possible. ISTJ. ISTJs are knowledge-based. They greatly desire and attain competence and use those things to push back against the uncertain and chaos, in their mind, of the external world. They are also FE blind, which means their style of social interactions will be pretty much exactly what you'd expect from a type 5. ISTJs will often be described as strong, stable, and stoic, the latter of which describes a person who isn't forthcoming with their emotions all that often. Basically, the ISTJ fits the type 5 pretty perfectly, so I'll put them in likely. ESTJ. ESTJs are assertive and willing to get things done without being asked. They are initiating, so the withdrawn nature of the 5 definitely clashes. They are definitely logical, which 5s often are, but it's a different kind. Instead of sitting around pondering and dissecting something in their minds, they'd rather be on the go, doing things, solving problems, and learning that way. 5s get assertive when they go into their growth line and borrow from the 8 energy, but no type can stay forever in their peak space. We can borrow from our growth type, but we all go back to our default type, which is natural. I'll put ESTJs in unlikely. Type 6. Loyal, supportive, and vigilant. They are faithful people who are frank and humorous. They are wired to mistrust and sniff out hidden agendas. With people, they are skeptics. They live in the world of security and rules, sometimes with a dash of rebellion. They are always prepared against danger. Their deepest fear is lacking guidance, direction, and not knowing the right way. ESTP. I can see how a counterphobic 6 could look like an ESTP. 6s resonate with the sentiment that to feel safe and relaxed would be too dangerous. That doesn't strike me as very ESTP-ish. The type 6 social style is compliant. They ingratiate due to fears that they can't make it on their own, or can't trust their own guidance. That is why they will want to connect themselves to people. It's a safety in numbers mindset. The reason 6s are tricky is because they're paradoxical in many ways. A counterphobic 6 can look like a type 8, which would fit the ESTP perfectly, but ultimately it's the motivations that don't strike me as fitting for the ESTP, so I'll put them in unlikely. ISTP. ISTPs have FE inferior, and interpersonal safety and cohesion is important to 6s. However, 6s are hypervigilant and observant, and ultimately a cerebral type, being part of the head triad. They use intellect and perception as a way to understand the world. Also, ISTPs are sometimes thrill seekers, and a rebellious 6 or one in a counterphobic phase will do just that. ISTPs line up with the skeptical nature of the type 6 too. Having any as a blind spot means they can be caught out by the most slippery types of the world. Over time, they can double down on their suspicious side. I'm going to put ISTPs in possible. INFJ. INFJs have FE and TI in the middle of their stack, so these functions are well balanced. That's very much in line with 6s understanding the world intellectually while focusing on the group cohesion or harmony of their gang. INFJs have SE inferior. 6s are extremely observant, switched on, and alert. INFJs tend to be a bit more detached and in their heads. 6s will notice things pretty quickly. If there's been a deviation, or you come home and something is slightly different to how you left it, 6s are more likely to notice that and start brainstorming whether there's some threat or danger because something's been tampered with. INFJs don't do well with those kinds of threats, but when it comes to people, they very much can. Since they're in tune with people's motivations, they can simulate what might go wrong in interactions, and can have a lot of anxiety and hypervigilance in that realm. I'm going to put INFJs in possible. ENFJ. 6s doubt everyone and everything. They are skeptics on a deep level, even towards people they're loyal to, although you might not guess it at first. I see ENFJs as being more free and welcoming, generally speaking. More trusting too. A 6 will welcome someone into a group only after they've passed a test, or proven they are trustworthy enough to join. They are not as open in the same way. If an ENFJ was a 6, it would be a conflicting combination when it comes to their approach to being social. ENFJs tend to take the risk on people and make their peace with being burned because of it sometimes. I'll put ENFJs in unlikely. ENTPs. 6's so-called passion or sin in the Enneagram system is fear. With this mindset, it's entirely possible that the new would seem somewhat threatening or increase the amount of uncertainty. That doesn't match up well with the ENTP approach to things at all. ENTPs embrace the new, the uncertain, the ambiguous. They live for that. To a large degree, the type 6 is fighting against those things, or at least against the negative effects of those things. ENTPs also have SI inferior, which means they can be out of touch with details, so they won't have that hypervigilance that characterizes the type 6. Although ENTPs often have a 6 wing as their main type, it's rare, so I'll put them in unlikely. INTP. Again, much more likely as a wing for INTPs, who are often 5s with a 6 wing. 6s often seek protection, be that in a group or an institution. Neither of those things are INTP tendencies. I have ISTPs in the possible category, and lots of the same things apply to INTPs, but the difference I see with ISTPs is their SE, and more broadly, their approach to life. They are much more likely to be in that hypervigilant and observant mold than INTPs, who are much more detached in their heads and ungrounded. So I'll put INTPs in unlikely. ISFJ. ISFJs are the most 6-esque type, similar to ISTJs, but in a softer package. For ISFJs, SI and FE can operate like gut instincts they might have about a person or situation. You might hear them say, something just seems off about this person or situation. They absorb information about people with ease. They pick up on their vibe, which is perfect for a 6, since they constantly scan people with skepticism. Their trust typically has to be earned, and that takes a long time. ISFJs, once they have an opinion of someone, can be deeply fixed with it and almost have a bad people radar. Even though ISFJs come across as agreeable, cooperative, and harmonious most of the time, those opinions they have will still be felt. ISFJs embody pretty much everything about the type 6, so they belong in likely. ESFJ. ESFJs have SI as the second function, and it's in service of FE. That goes very well with 6's compliant social style. 6s can take on too much responsibility. That is a trap that ESFJs often fall into. They want to be protectors, guides, facilitators, and so much more for the people in their lives. It's often a recipe that leads to burnout for them. I see the type 6 as being very grounded, maybe the most grounded Enneagram type. Hence why I'd put ESFJs higher than ENFJs for this one. A 6-wing 7, social sexual, would be a perfect ESFJ. So ESFJs in likely. ENTJ. I often semi-joke about ENTJs having pathological self-confidence. 6s have to be reminded that they're actually winning when they are. Even in full sexual, contrarian, counterphobic mode, their assertiveness would be reactive. It's a way for them to channel that anxiety about some danger they perceive, or to prove to themselves that they are strong. An ENTJ would not think like that. They are much more proactive in their assertiveness, and it comes from a more calm and self-assured place. ENTJs belong in unlikely. INTJ. INTJs don't feel like the most natural fit for the type 6 at first glance, but there are some things that apply. INTJs see dangers that other people don't. This can be in a day-to-day sense, but also on a societal level too. I can picture the entire spectrum from doomsday prepper, person building rockets to get us off the doomed planet, or just someone investing in an innovative technology that's going to solve something most people don't even see as a problem yet. So I think that INTJs can be receptive to danger in a 6-esque way. If you can see further than most, that opens you up to more potential fears. I'll put INTJs in possible. ISFP. So I think I've seen that ISFPs are often type 6s, and that surprises me somewhat. ISFPs desire independence to a great degree. They'll stand up for what they think and feel, even when alienation is a risk. 6s, on the other hand, tend to be more compliant. Fostering and maintaining their social groups gives them a sense of security. That doesn't strike me as the typical ISFP approach. An ISFP being a loyalist, as I've seen the type 6 described, is of course entirely possible. ISFPs will fight for the people in their lives, but I don't see them having the same underlying motivations and fears as the type 6. Perhaps there is a connection between 6s seeing danger and threats in the world, and the archetypical ISFP distrust towards the systems and structures in society. They have that sense of doubt in common, but it's not a one-to-one link in my view, so I think ISFPs are unlikely. ESFP. Similar reasoning to the ESTP. ESFPs tend to act with boldness even when they're uncertain underneath it. If they saw danger and threats everywhere, it would significantly hamper their ability to be, well, themselves. Perhaps the counterphobic angle would work here, but I don't think that makes much sense either. So ESFPs, unlikely. ENFP. Any DOMs with SI inferior is already odd for 6s. 6s are very well aware of rules, both spoken and unspoken, and want guidelines to know the best approach to things. Even if they may break those rules if the situation necessitates it, they're still central to the 6. They depend on protocols, procedures, and best practices to have a firm footing for how to act. ENFPs are comfortable with, or will certainly tolerate uncertainty in pursuit of the novel. That is very much at odds with the mindset of the 6. So ENFPs are unlikely. INFP. INFPs are very individualistic. Already, that isn't an obvious fit with the type 6. INFPs are much more likely to be iconoclasts than compliant, happy to shirk convention just out of principle, and definitely not rely on it to chart the course of their life. 6s consider the well-trodden path first because it's reliable, it's safe, it's a good option. Again, if the situation requires it, they will deviate, they will break rules, but it's not their default. INFPs, by contrast, want to wander so far that the beaten path is a distant memory. INFPs are going to go in unlikely. ISTJ. SI DOMs are the perfect match for 6s. ISTJs are loyal and hard-working people. They can preempt and challenge you about eventualities you haven't thought of that could go wrong. They have a built-in radar for pitfalls. Both ISTJs and type 6s are very much worst-case scenario people. Their mind naturally goes that way. It's also in the nature of 6s to ask a lot of questions. That is very similar to the need for ISTJs to gather lots of data. They want to ground their decisions in as much information, ideally concrete and tangible information, as possible. Although you wouldn't describe ISTJs as social in the conventional sense, they put great stock and great effort into their relationships. They feel a sense of duty towards them and want to make them strong. So ISTJs belong in likely. ESTJ. 6s are known as problem solvers. In my view, ESTJs might be the best problem solvers. They have the action-oriented TE as a dominant function that is fantastic at organizational and logistical intelligence, SI, which is diligent, precise, detail-oriented, and a powerful databank of knowledge, then NE for a sprinkle of creativity and out-of-the-box thinking. Like the ISTJs, ESTJs put great stock in their relationships. They cultivate them, support them, and often take charge in them. They are forceful supporters. They also value and ensure security. They want things to run smoothly. They like standardization because it works. You find something that solves a problem, then make it a system. They are preemptive and proactive in stopping bad scenarios coming to be, so they overlap greatly with 6s. The only small area of divergence is that 6s can sometimes be stuck in analysis paralysis, whereas ESTJs are usually very decisive. But aside from that, it's a perfect match. So ESTJs in likely. Type 7. Curious, spontaneous and exuberant. With people they're engaging and sociable. They are compelled to avoid pain and distract themselves with adventure, fun, and a damn good time. They are sharp of mind, resourceful and eternally upbeat. Their deepest fears are deprivation, boredom and pain. ESTPs. 7's passion is gluttony, as in a desire to experience more of everything pleasurable. Their social style is assertive. Their focus of attention is external, and they have a positive outlook when it comes to resolving problems. They are optimists. All of that is usually spot on for ESTPs. In fact, there is nothing about the 7 that can't be found in an ESTP. A central quality of the 7s is that the moment a job or task becomes boring, or when they're bored with a person, they leave, or at least really want to. Bailing when the fire has gone out is easy for them. That independent streak is entirely consistent with the ESTP, so I'll put them in likely. ISTP. 7s are assertive in the sense that they're unlikely to be doing something that they don't want to do. ISTPs are notoriously difficult to force or cajole into something that doesn't naturally interest them. ISTPs can be thrill seekers. That tendency is something they have in common with the type 7. However, 7s are generally social people who can get by on their joyful energy and charm. People, after all, are a source of much of the excitement that 7s crave from life. ISTPs, by contrast, are rarely people. I would also say that ISTPs are more so exponents of a minimalist and stoic approach to life. They aren't naturally indulgent or hedonistic, despite being high SE types, so ultimately, they belong in unlikely. INFJs. Type 7s are externally focused. For INFJs, I think their internal life outweighs their external life by orders of magnitude. INFJs have an internal, universe. Even if INFJs can be socially smooth with their FE, 7s are more forceful in their energy. Also, when it comes to energy, 7s are usually high energy people. They are frivolous with it, whereas INFJs are very much energy conservers. It is an unlikely pairing, so I'll put INFJs in unlikely. ENFJs. Both ENFJs and type 7s are often gregarious people. ENFJs have much social charm bestowed upon them, much of which stems from their dominant FE. ENFJs tend to enjoy being the centre of attention, being a catalyst for excitement and inspiration, all of which is very in line with the mindset of 7s. They are connectors, people who bridge unlikely gaps. The third function of any type is one that they enjoy feeding, indulging in, and serves as a kind of release mechanism. So they greatly value the sensory world and all the pleasures that come with it. Although 7s are more assertive than the typical ENFJ, ENFJs do have that powerful presence and energy that creates the same effect. So ENFJs in likely. ENTPs. 7s can have a monkey mind, easily distracted, impulsive, and chasing multiple interests. As long as it is fun or pleasurable, 7s can escape their dread of pain with distractions. 7s are a fear type after all, as are all types that are part of the head triad. ENTPs tend to have no problem asserting themselves, just like the type 7. Both ENTPs and type 7s fall naturally, or should I say devilishly, into that lovable and charming rogue archetype. The fit is quite perfect, so ENTPs in likely. INTPs. The biggest clash here is that 7s are extroverts. Even though INTPs have NE in a prominent position, it still works in service of their TI, which is a deeply internally focused process. The swashbuckling and risk-taking nature of the 7s doesn't ring true for INTPs. INTPs can have indulgences, but they are more low-key hedonists who will give way to pleasure in the form of habits and comfort. They are not going to be forcefully hedonistic like the 7 can be. I also think that INTPs can deal with harsh realities very well, and that is a sort of pain, a psychological form. 7s may be more likely to avoid that, so INTPs, unlikely. ISFJ. 7s are characterised by a positive outlook, always believing that they can win, or get themselves out of trouble, usually trouble that they put themselves in. It brings to mind Han Solo saying, "Never tell me the odds." There is an inherent optimism. ISFJs, by contrast, are forever looking forward to negative futures, with the aim of avoiding them, or navigating them with the best damage control measures in place. So these two types differ on a deep fundamental level. So ISFJs, unlikely. ESFJ. ESFJs match the type 7 when it comes to their focus on the external world. In this case, people, and also their optimistic nature. ESFJs are masterful at finding and emphasizing the best in a situation. In a sense, that's what FE is. A filter that chooses the most appropriate things to say in a situation. In my experience, ESFJs also have a hedonistic streak in them too, and can definitely lean on that to escape from feelings, thoughts, or situations they find painful. They differ in their lifestyle choices, which are much more restrictive than a type 7 would usually be okay with. Lots of routine, structure, social obligations, and relationship maintenance. 7s are also more disagreeable than ESFJs usually are, so I'll put them in possible. ENTJs. Types change a lot as they age. Younger ENTJs can be much more indulgent people, almost resembling a certain version of an ESFP. That can remain true for some ENTJs over the course of their whole life, often leading to them mistyping as ESFPs. I think that kind of ENTJ could fit really well with the type 7. They have that outward focus, judging things mainly by the results they get. They're extroverted, social, forceful, and love to embrace the sensory and sensual aspects of life with that third-SE they have. There is a spectrum here though. The more introverted variants of the ENTJ can be hard to distinguish from INTJs. Those ENTJs would definitely not be fitting for the Type 7, so I'll put them in possible. INTJs. Curiously, Type 7s have the fixation of planning. That is something that INTJs are known for, to the point of stereotype. But the Type 7 brand of planning is quite different, especially in its motivation. 7s plan in a scattershot and sometimes escapist way. They throw lots of possibilities out there, such as projects to start or places to go, to conjure up that feeling they're searching for, that life can be endlessly fun. INTJs do not plan like that. In fact, I think INTJs are almost the antithesis of the Type 7, so INTJs are unlikely. ISFPs. There are quite a few overlaps here. Both types exist with comfort in the present moment. New experiences, adventure, and the pursuit of sensory pleasure unite the two. ISFPs also have the, selfishness, let's say, that Type 7s sometimes display. They both want to live life on their own uncompromising terms. The part that doesn't fit is the extroverted nature of the Type 7. ISFPs can be extreme introverts who prefer their solitude over nearly anything. However, some ISFPs can also be towards the ambiverted or extroverted side of the spectrum, especially if their environment allows them to flow in that SE way. I'll put them tentatively in possible. ESFP. 7s are the Peter Pan type, i.e. people who retain the spirit of youth throughout their whole life, but also want to resist the sense of obligation that slowly creeps in as we age. That is something ESFPs often relate to. In fact, that's a big part of their charm. Their ability to liberate people from the trappings of adult life. I think the fixation of planning in the way that we've previously described, plus the avoidance of introspection that 7s display, line up with inferior NI and blind spot TI very nicely. The passion or sin of the 7 is gluttony. That, I think is fair to say, is something that lines up well with the ESFP. Wanton excess and decadence are constant tempting passengers in the mind of both types. Life, in their view, is to be devoured. I'll try to capture this in a Hunter S. Thompson quote. Life should not be a journey to the grave with the intention of arriving safely in a pretty and well-preserved body, but rather to skid in broadside in a cloud of smoke, thoroughly used up, totally worn out, and loudly proclaiming, "Wow, what a ride." ESFP, likely. ENFPs. ENFPs are vibrant, energetic, and inspiring. It seems to me that both ENFPs and Type 7s are tapping into the same life force. Their light-hearted and flighty nature is a perfect fit for the Type 7. However, as I always feel the need to point out, there is a darkness and heaviness to the ENFP as well. You might not always notice this about them, but if you get close enough, you'll see it. Perhaps that is also the dark underbelly of the Type 7 too. Both types are also characterized by a love of freedom. Wanderlust is a word that accurately captures the way that both ENFPs and Type 7s move through the world. It's not just the desire to move, but also the romanticization of the unexplored land. To me, this really is a perfect fit. So ENFPs, unlikely. INFPs. INFPs are interested in depth of experience, particularly in the emotional realm, whereas Type 7s desire breadth of experience. So right away there is a clear clash, one between internal depth and external breadth. INFPs don't tend to characterize emotions as good or bad, but interesting and non-interesting. That's a big difference to the Type 7, who will actively avoid certain emotions. The introspective and often melancholic nature of INFPs contrasts greatly with the optimistic and high-energy outlook of Type 7s. They are fundamentally motivated by different things, so INFP, unlikely. ISTJ. 7s are some unholy union of FOMO and YOLO. Neither of those things are applicable to the ISTJ. They are another type who are antithetical to 7s. ISTJs are masters of the grind, mainly because, to them, it doesn't feel like a grind at all. In fact, it feels good. The slow burn, the gradual build, the long-term consistency that, day to day, seems small, but over the medium and long term is unstoppable. They love that. 7s do not. That saps their lifeblood from them, and they'd do anything to avoid it. So ISTJs, unlikely. ESTJs. ESTJs are powerhouses of organisation, routine, efficiency, and measurable impact. They are people of action. 7s, despite their energy, can rightly be accused of talking more than doing. ESTJs are high-energy people with direction. Type 7s are high-energy people who are scattered and dispersed across many activities and mental spaces. ESTJs are focused. They can be witty, charismatic, and socially engaging when they're in the mood for it, but they don't have the same performative nature of 7s. So ESTJs, unlikely. Type 8s. Assertive, decisive, and bold. They are combative, protective fighters. They are wired to strive for dominance, assert control, and avoid weakness at all cost. With people, they are direct, protective, and confrontational. Their deepest fear is weakness and powerlessness. ESTPs. 8's passion is lust. ESTPs are lustful. 8's focus of attention is external, since they don't want to be controlled. They scan the environment to gauge who and where the power is. ESTPs are masters of navigating power dynamics. 8's have a reactive nature. They will naturally push back and assert themselves, often with the aim of achieving some kind of dominance. For example, someone challenging a police officer after being pulled over could very well be an 8. It's not always wise, but 8's have the natural tendency to be confrontational. It's no surprise that 8's social style is to be assertive. ESTPs are the most likely types to be an 8. ISTP. ISTPs can be forthright, firm, and strict, so they can definitely be assertive socially. 8's are known for being direct, and sometimes just blunt. ISTPs have the same reputation. Excessive interpersonal conflicts and difficult relationships are a risk for both types. Both types also fight pathologically for their independence. The underlying motivation for both is a desire to avoid ever being controlled. So there is an overlap here, but also a caveat. ISTPs are often very introverted and even withdrawn. 8's, by contrast, tend to be take-charge types, often running the risk of overstepping people's boundaries. ISTPs rarely do this because they don't want to be that involved with people. If anything, they feel like other people are often encroaching upon their boundaries. I'll put ISTPs in possible. INFJ. Even if an INFJ were concerned with power dynamics, their style of doing so does not resemble the type 8. INFJs are introverts who are also pretty socially smooth. They're rarely bombastic or in your face about anything. 8's are expansive and sometimes explosive. INFJs are not generally any of those things. This one is a very unlikely combination. ENFJ. The so-called fixation of the type 8 is vengeance. That's not to say that ENFJs can't be vengeful, but there's a level of innate hostility that 8's have that ENFJs do not. ENFJs are never trying to be socially dominating. They can end up being that because of their energy, but generally they use charm and finesse. 8's can be very my way or the highway, whereas ENFJs are willing to adapt around people. Again, ENFJs are in unlikely. ENTP. ENTPs can be challenging and provocative people who push boundaries. They can also display an intellectual aggression and like to dominate in that area. They certainly value independence and push back forcefully on any attempts to control them. They also have no problem being assertive. The question then becomes, how important is the physicality of the type 8? 8's are part of the gut triad, who are synonymous with a sense of physicality, but ENTPs don't really value SE at all, and, as I mentioned, are more intellectually or verbally aggressive than physical. There is a leap you have to make in order for these two types to fit, but I think the gap is bridgeable, so I'll put them in possible. INTPs. 8's scan their environment for power. Who has it? Are the people around them friends or foes? Who has control? Etc. INTPs can be completely out of touch with the social dynamics of their environment, or their environment in general. 8's usually project an imposing presence, brewing, sulking, exploding, being reactive. INTPs rarely do this, and simply don't care about such things, and aren't outwardly expressive in that way. Even the most intellectually aggressive INTP feels like a big stretch for the type 8. So INTPs are in unlikely. ISFJs. ISFJs are measured people. There is grace and forethought to their actions. 8's can be act first and ask questions later types of people. 8's can be rash, whereas ISFJs are much more judicious. So, there's a clear difference here between an aggressive, reactive style versus a more steady and thoughtful approach. I will say that ISFJs are certainly capable of force and aggression, but only when deeply provoked into it. So ISFJs, unlikely. ESFJ. Purely in terms of vibe, when I imagine an ESFJ who is more domineering and forceful, I could see this working. I picture them very much taking charge socially, reacting very quickly to anyone who violates the social norms and etiquettes they believe in, and generally being a very big, bold, and protective person who looks after the people close to them and fiercely defends against any threats. The clash simply comes from them being FE DOMs. Struggling with being confrontational is a problem for ESFJs, and definitely not for type 8's. I consider it possible for this combo, but ultimately unlikely. ENTJs. Type 8's project strength in order to compensate for their hatred and fear of being vulnerable or weak. They have an aggressive approach to life, always on the lookout for things that might be threats to their power or limit their freedom. ENTJs are often like this too. Very few ENTJs are happy being vulnerable and often seek power through achievement and success. Although the third slot function of SE is good to point to when explaining how ENTJs can be 8-ish, I think it's the combination of their TE and SE. Both functions like to impose themselves on the external world. Type 8s are deeply grounded and very much in the now. I believe that TE-SE combo is the same way. ENTJs do have NI as a prominent function, but it's used more as a tool, a way to solve problems and chart courses. But you'll meet plenty of ENTJs who seem like ESTPs or ESFPs precisely because they live in the here and now, getting things done, being present, being pragmatic and realistic. There are some ENTJs who are much more like INTJs, intellectual, academic, and much more so cerebral strategists. Those ENTJs, I would agree, aren't a good fit for the Type 8, but generally, I think they are. So ENTJs, unlikely. INTJs. INTJs can be assertive and forceful in their way, but 8s are externally focused, reactive, sometimes impulsive, and act first instead of spending ages pondering. INTJs are internally focused, proactive, rarely impulsive, and always planful. So yeah, unlikely. ISFPs. I've often hinted at the fiery side of ISFPs. They often get described as gentle and soft, but I think that misses a big part of them. They can be flammable. If we take the reactive side of the Type 8, the side that immediately pushes back against being controlled, that lines up perfectly with the ISFP mindset. ISFPs can also be disagreeable enough to tolerate any social upheaval that comes from the combative side of the Type 8. Similarly, this challenger archetype that the Type 8 falls into, a person who will stand up to authority or question them, is exactly what the ISFP archetype does. Although the take charge and externally focused parts don't match up, there is enough there for me to put them in possible. ESFP. ESFPs having SE as the dominant function is in line with 8's passion, lust, external focus of attention, and assertive nature. 8s can be materialistic and want a lot. They are prone to excess. Third slot TE lines up well with 8s. Taking charge and cutting away the unnecessary are hallmarks for both. ESFPs have a flighty side. That's well established. But there's a lot of fire in there too. In fact, ESFPs can be a dominating presence if they're that way inclined. Reactivity and force are inborn. At first I was tempted to put them in possible, but I actually think this one is likely. That trifecta of SE, FI, and TE in a row really match up well with the Type 8. External focus, force, a volatile fiery nature, and assertive. So ESFP is likely. ENFP. It is rare to meet an ENFP who is concerned with personal power dynamics. However, they are very cognizant of the power hierarchies in society, especially when they are unjust in their view. In that way, they do line up well with the challenger archetype of the Type 8. They're also both externally focused, but 8s are grounded people. They are realistic and pragmatic. ENFPs can have their head in the clouds, or multiple clouds at the same time. ENFPs will rarely be overtly disagreeable or confrontational either. The only times they will be are on matters of principle, or simply being eccentric to the point of violating social norms. So ENFPs, unlikely. INFP. INFPs have that skeleton of dominant FI and third slot SI. Both of those are very inwardly focused functions. That becomes supercharged when they act in tandem. In between those two functions is NE, which is very detached from the present moment, instead being caught up in future possibilities. INFPs also then have SE as a blind spot. SE is one of the functions that most connects with the Type 8. I think INFPs are the least like the 8s of all. ISTJ. There is some overlap here. ISTJs can be assertive. They don't hold back socially since they're FE blind. They have a protective mindset, like the Type 8 too. They can be take-charge people too, if it falls within their area of competence. One big difference for me is the level of risk tolerance for each. Type 8s have a desire for more, and will take chances to get it. ISTJs are more maintainers of what they value, more rulers than conquerors. If anything, they synergize with 8s instead of being them. ISTJs are exponents of moderation. They are more likely to be stoic than excessive. I would also say that ISTJs are one of the types whose introverted world is the most vast, yet least talked about in typology. So that outward-facing approach to life doesn't really match with them, despite them being practical. So ISTJs, unlikely. ESTJ. ESTJs, in my view, are the most take-charge types. They're assertive, action-oriented, and often domineering. They are grounded, practical people who go after what they want and make things happen. 8s fear being vulnerable and overcompensate for that by asserting control externally. That lines up perfectly with the dominant TE stepping in to protect the soft FI core they have. Basically, all of the ENTJ reasons apply here, except without having that caveat of an intuitive function in the top two, which makes the ENTJ less grounded than the ESTJ. So ESTJ, an easy likely. Type 9. Peaceful, receptive, and conflict-averse. They are open, compromising, and laid back. Their passive nature can make them indecisive and complacent. With people, they are diplomatic, accommodating, and agreeable. Their deepest fear is abandonment and disconnection. ESTP. The biggest clash here is their energy. ESTPs can indeed be chilled out at times, especially when they're leaning into relaxation mode, but their default state is high energy and intense. They like to move fast if they can. 9s desire peace, and whether they seek it consciously or not, ESTPs are fighters. They shake things up. There is an inherently provocative nature to them, even when they're just being themselves. In order for an ESTP to be a peacemaker, they have to suppress their more forceful, shooting from the hip nature, which is rarely sustainable. So ESTPs, unlikely. ISTP. ISTP 9s have always struck me as unusual on paper, yet they're clearly observable in reality. I know people of this combination. It's strange because 9s are agreeable peacemakers, whereas ISTPs can be prickly, standoffish, and certainly not people. But I think that latter part is relevant. ISTPs won't bother you if you don't bother them. Because of their independent nature, they are completely averse to drama or human entanglements. 9s put other people's needs above their own. That doesn't square instinctively with how we view the ISTP. However, they do love to be useful to people, ideally in a tangible way, and can be extremely devoted to the people they care about. They also get immense joy, perhaps the most joy in life, from solving problems. If they can do that for people, it's ideal. Also, ISTPs are profoundly chilled out people. I'm going to put them in possible. INFJ. There is a paradoxical aspect that 9s and INFJs have in common. Both are very focused on other people, yet also often withdrawn. To me, that tension is a huge part of what makes both types what they are. The biggest fear of the Type 9 is conflict and disconnection from others. On some level, they seek harmony and peace in their environment to avoid this. I'd say that maps very well onto the INFJ approach. Being misunderstood, or just not understood, is a recurring issue for INFJs. Like 9s, they can be out of touch with what they desire because they're focused too much on other people. Or, in the case of the INFJ, absorb other people's emotions too readily. There are some clashes too. 9s are quite grounded and in touch with the physical parts of life, especially the comforts of life. INFJs are more in their heads and sometimes downright disconnected from that. I think the calmness of the INFJ somewhat counteracts that though. So overall, I do think this is a likely combination. ENFJ. Both ENFJs and 9s adapt socially to keep the peace and may struggle with self-neglect. Dominant FE in ENFJs makes them adept at both sensing and resolving discord. Their heightened sensitivity makes them great adapters around people. There is no level of social granularity for which their lens cannot be attuned. Again, there is a difference when it comes to the energy of these two types. Whereas INFJs are more low-key and laid back, ENFJs can be balls of energy, and a certain forcefulness and presence arises from that. Type 9s can come and go calmly, without much fuss. When ENFJs enter a room or conversation, you notice. To me, that is quite a big difference. It affects how you feel around the type. So I'll put ENFJs in possible. ENTP. ENTPs are contrarians who prod and poke people even when they're not trying to. There is a subtype of ENTP, the FE heavy one, that might match up with the Type 9. Those would be in the classic mold of focusing on other people to the exclusion of their own sense of identity. However, even in that case, it wouldn't always be with the aim of peacemaking necessarily. ENTPs are fundamentally challenging people. They don't and can't really accept what is. In the end, they will choose disturbing or disrupting the peace in the name of seeking what they really desire. So ENTPs, unlikely. INTP. The truth is often the greatest casualty in the name of peacekeeping. That for INTPs is already a deal breaker. That is not to say that INTPs are a naturally disagreeable presence. In fact, they are generally very calm people to be around. But when it comes to keeping the peace for its own sake, that's really the top priority. Loss of connection is a big fear for the Type 9. Though INTPs often want connection and struggle to get it while they learn the rules of the social realm, it is hardly their deepest fear. So INTPs, unlikely. ISFJ. ISFJs put great stock in their relationships. In many cases, it can be the focal point of their life. Like all people who are consistent, their strengths compound over time. To lose a relationship they've invested in stings them at the deepest level. Like the INFJs, they match up with this strange combination of being people-focused, yet withdrawn. No other type can cultivate such a sense of enduring comfort. They wrap you up in it, be that for pleasure or protection, and never let the dread of disharmony encroach upon the safe spaces they fashion. 9s have a certain relaxed demeanour to them. ISFJs are naturally hard-working people, but in my experience, there is a light ease about them. When you step back and look at how much they're getting done, it's a lot. But to see it in real time is to witness someone with immense self-possession and grace. I think ISFJs belong in likely. ESFJ. The diplomatic, conflict-averse, and agreeable nature of the 9 lines up perfectly with the ESFJ. They are both receptive to people, sometimes at their own expense. That core 9 fear of abandonment through disconnection is also a major thing that characterises the ESFJ. I have the same view as with the ENFJ though. ESFJs are usually high-energy people. Their schedules, for example, can be dizzying affairs. They are initiators, the first person to organise an event or start a conversation. This can be imposing, and that isn't something I associate with the Type 9. Also, ESFJs don't line up with the Type 9's recurring issues of being passive and indecisive, so I'll put them in possible. ENTJ. The sin of the Type 9 is sloth. It's hard to think of a less slothful type than the ENTJ. If the priority of the Type 9 is to maintain the peace, the priority of the ENTJ is success. Whatever they need to do in the name of achieving that, they will, including disturbing the peace, and even war if necessary. ENTJs might be the most unlikely type for a 9. INTJ. Many of the same reasons as the ENTJ apply here. INTJs are goal-oriented, be they abstract or tangible. Given that they have FE as a blind spot function, building emotional consensus and fostering harmony is rarely at the top of their to-do list. INTJs have FI as their fuel in life. They know what they want, what's meaningful to them, what they value. Type 9s can easily lose touch with those things as they put their focus too much on other people to their own detriment. That is not a common INTJ problem, so INTJs unlikely. ISFP. I've seen that Type 9 is supposed to be one of the more common types for ISFPs. I have some doubts about this being a perfect fit though. ISFPs have a rebellious streak baked into their DNA. They are also more fiery than often described. Although they won't borrow trouble, they certainly aren't dedicated to peacemaking either. Where I think they do fit is their sense of empathy and respect for people. Their tolerance for the individuality of others is unmatched. Because of that, many people feel at ease with them. They can be themselves. I also think, deep down, ISFPs do fear disconnection from people. They are seen as firmly independent at times, but it's often in a reactive way. Feeling outcast and ostracised is common for them, but it's not as if they like it. I'll put them in possible. ESFP. I'll start by saying that the raucous reputation ESFPs have is not entirely warranted. I have known very chilled out ESFPs. However, when we try to line this up with the energy of the 9, it doesn't work. ESFPs desire action and emotional intensity. They are willing to tolerate or lean forcefully into disruption in order to bring those things about. 9s are low-profile people who prefer a slow pace of life. ESFPs are not, so for them, unlikely. ENFP. ENFPs have a restless nature. Wanderlust is an ever-present semi-angel, semi-devil on their shoulder, tapping them and saying, what and where next? That is at odds with the more placid and passive energy of the Type 9. ENFPs are always willing to rock the boat or sink the boat if it goes against their values or what they believe to be right. I see ENFPs as being a bit too chaotic to be 9s, having ups and downs in terms of their focus, energy levels, and intensity. 9s are more flatline and consistent in those areas, so ENFPs, unlikely. INFP. It's useful to compare INFPs to the ISFP for the Type 9. ISFPs have SE as one of the most powerful functions. That makes them more forceful and fiery. INFPs have SE as a blind spot. That makes them more passive, gentle, and non-combative. All things that line up well with the Type 9. INFPs gain immense relief from and like to indulge in their SI. This makes them creatures of comfort when it comes to their environment, as are Type 9s. With people, the peacemaker role is one they often adopt. It comes down to their non-judgmental nature. Any fierce individualism that comes out is triggered most by people unfairly judging them. It's usually a one-way thing. So INFPs, likely. ISTJ. ISTJs are a personality marked by relentlessness and grit. What may be a monumental grind for most people is just another day for them. They are fundamentally self-directed people. 9s, by contrast, often need the energy of other people to get going. Being FE blind is not conducive to peacemaking, and ISTJs are much more in the mold of cynics and skeptics, unlike the more positive Type 9. So this one, unlikely. ESTJ. Let's keep this simple. ESTJs are rarely withdrawn, never passive, don't struggle with being indecisive, will gladly disturb the peace if things are not getting done, and aren't usually most people's conception of laid back. Unlikely. Please like, subscribe, do all the other things I said in the video, and also, after that, join me on the Love Who Discord server. The link for that and everything else is down below.